The grand cathedral stood like a monument to wealth and power, its soaring marble columns draped in cascades of white roses and crystal shades. Isabella Munro stood at the entrance, her fingers gripping her father's arms so tightly that her knuckles had turned white beneath the French lace of her gloves. The ivory gown she wore cost more than most people earned in a year, but it felt like a costume for a role she never auditioned for. Her father, Thomas Munro, squeezed her hand gently. His once mighty shipping empire had crumbled under aggressive competition from Blackwell Industries, and this wedding was the lifeline that would save everything he had built. Isabella understood the stakes. She had agreed to this arrangement with her eyes open, telling herself that sacrifice was the price of family loyalty. But understanding something intellectually and facing it emotionally were two different things. The organ music swelled, and she began the long walk down the aisle. At the far end, standing beneath an arch of white orchids, was Harrison Blackwell. Even from a distance, his presence dominated the space. He was 32 years old, impossibly handsome with dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from stone. His custom-tailored charcoal suit fit him perfectly, emphasizing broad shoulders and a lean, powerful frame. But it was his eyes that caught her attention as she drew closer, gray eyes that watched her approach with the same detached interest one might show examining a painting in a gallery. Isabella's best friend Charlotte sat in the third row, her eyes glistening with tears. They had spent the previous night talking until dawn, with Charlotte trying to convince Isabella that perhaps this could work, that arranged marriages sometimes grew into love. Isabella had smiled sadly and told her friend that fairy tales were for children. When she finally reached the altar, her father placed her hand in Harrison's. The contact sent a jolt through her system. His hand was large, warm, and completely impersonal. He held her hand the way one might hold a business document, necessary but meaningless. Their eyes met for the first time that day, and Isabella saw nothing in those gray depths. No warmth, no curiosity, not even anger. Just emptiness. The priest began the ceremony, his voice droning on about love and commitment, words that seemed absurd in the context of what was happening. Isabella barely heard him. Her mind was racing, cataloging every detail of this moment that she knew would define the rest of her life. The scratchy feeling of her veil against her cheek. The overwhelming scent of flowers that made her feel slightly sick. The weight of hundreds of eyes boring into her back. When the priest asked Harrison if he would take Isabella as his lawfully wedded wife, there was a pause. It lasted only a second, but in that second, Isabella felt the full weight of her humiliation. He was making it clear, even here, even now, that this was a transaction he was reluctantly completing. "I do," Harrison finally said, his voice flat and businesslike. Then it was her turn. The priest's words seemed to come from very far away. Isabella opened her mouth, and the words that came out surprised even her. "I do," she said clearly, then added something that wasn't part of the script, "but I want everyone here to know that this marriage changes nothing about who I am. You may have bought my hand, Harrison Blackwell, but you'll never have my heart. In fact, you are nothing to me. Just as I am clearly nothing to you." A collective gasp rippled through the cathedral. Harrison's eyes widened fractionally, the first real emotion she had seen from him. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, something dangerous flashed in those gray eyes. Her father made a small, strangled sound behind her. But Isabella held Harrison's gaze steadily, refusing to look away. The priest, flustered, hurried through the exchange of rings. The simple platinum band Harrison slid onto her finger felt cold and foreign. When she placed his ring on his finger, her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her chin raised. "You may kiss the bride," the priest said, his voice uncertain. Harrison stepped closer, and Isabella forced herself not to flinch. His hand came up to cup her jaw, and she felt the calluses on his palm despite his wealth. He leaned in, and she closed her eyes, bracing herself. But the kiss, when it came, was not what she expected. It was brief but not entirely cold. His lips pressed against hers with just enough pressure to be felt, lasting only a heartbeat before he pulled away. But in that moment, she felt something. A spark. A possibility. And judging by the way Harrison's eyes darkened when he stepped back, he had felt it too. The reception was held at the Blackwell estate, a sprawling mansion overlooking the city. Isabella moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting congratulations from people who knew the truth but pretended otherwise. Business associates clapped Harrison on the back, making jokes about newlywed bliss while their eyes held knowing cynicism. Her mother, Grace, pulled her aside at one point. "Isabella, darling, what you said at the altar," her mother whispered urgently, her face pale beneath her pearl necklace. "People are talking." "Let them talk," Isabella replied quietly. "I won't start this marriage with lies, mother. Not even polite ones." The first dance was torture. Harrison held her correctly, one hand at her waist, the other clasping her hand, maintaining exactly the right distance that etiquette demanded. They moved together flawlessly because they had both been raised in this world, trained since childhood in all the social graces. But there was no warmth in it. "That was quite a statement you made," Harrison said, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the music. "I thought honesty was the best policy," Isabella replied, matching his tone. "Honesty." He almost smiled, but it was not a kind expression. "Is that what you call humiliating me in front of everyone who matters in this city? I humiliated you?" Isabella looked up at him, anger finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "You've barely looked at me all day. You announced to the world without words that I'm nothing more than a business acquisition. At least I had the courage to say it out loud." Something shifted in his expression. The coldness remained, but beneath it, she saw a flicker of respect. Or perhaps it was just surprise that she had fought back. The dance ended, and they separated immediately. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and champagne she didn't drink. Finally, mercifully, it was time to leave. The drive to what would now be her home was silent. Harrison sat on his side of the luxury car, checking his phone, completely ignoring her. Isabella stared out the window at the city lights, wondering how her life had come to this point. She had graduated top of her class from business school. She spoke 4 languages. She had once dreamed of building something of her own, making her mark on the world in ways that had nothing to do with her family name. Now she was Mrs. Harrison Blackwell, a title that felt like a cage. The Blackwell mansion was even more impressive at night, lit up like something from a movie. Staff lined up to greet them, all wearing expressions of carefully trained neutrality. The head housekeeper, an elegant woman named Sophia, showed Isabella to her rooms with the same courtesy she would show any guest. "Mr. Blackwell has asked me to inform you that your suite is in the West Wing," Sophia said, opening the door to a bedroom that was larger than the apartment Isabella had lived in during college. "His personal quarters are in the East Wing. If you need anything at all, please use the phone on the nightstand. Separate rooms. Separate wings." The message was clear. After Sophia left, Isabella stood in the middle of the opulent bedroom, still wearing her wedding dress. She walked to the window and looked out at the grounds below, manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people's salaries. This was her life now. Beautiful. Expensive. Empty. A knock at the door made her turn. Harrison stood in the doorway, having changed out of his wedding suit into dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Even dressed casually, he looked intimidating. "We should establish some rules," he said without preamble. "Of course," Isabella replied, keeping her voice steady. "Rules. That's what every marriage needs." He ignored her sarcasm and stepped into the room. "In public, we will present a united front. You will attend events with me, smile for photographs, and play the role of devoted wife. I will do the same. But here, in private, we stay out of each other's way. I have my life, you have yours. We don't need to pretend. And what about the business? Isabella asked. Her father's company was now merged with Blackwell Industries, but the exact terms of her involvement had never been specified. What about it? I worked for Monroe Shipping for 5 years. I know that business inside and out. I assume I'll have a role in the merged operations? Harrison's expression was unreadable. We'll see. For now, focus on settling in here. The dismissal was clear, and it lit a fire in Isabella's chest. She took a step toward him, her chin raised. Let me be very clear about something, Harrison. I agreed to marry you to save my family's legacy, but I am not some decorative object to be placed on a shelf. I have skills, knowledge, and ambition. If you think I'm going to spend my days planning dinner parties and shopping, you don't know me at all. You're right, Harrison said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I don't know you at all. And I don't particularly want to. This arrangement is temporary until the merger is complete and stable. After that, we can discuss more permanent solutions. Until then, stay out of my way, Isabella. I have an empire to run, and I don't have time for dramatic displays like the one you put on today. He turned to leave, but Isabella's voice stopped him. Harrison. He paused but didn't turn around. You're right that you don't know me. But here's something you should understand. I don't break easily, and I don't give up. You may have married me thinking you were getting a convenient, compliant wife. But what you actually got was a partner who has no intention of being invisible. So if you want to stay out of my way, I suggest you find a way to move, because I'm not standing still. He did turn then, and for the first time all day, she saw genuine emotion on his face. Surprise. Anger. And underneath it all, something that might have been interest. We'll see, he said finally, then left, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that somehow felt more final than a slam. Isabella stood alone in her beautiful prison, her wedding dress suddenly feeling unbearably heavy. She reached back to start unfastening it, her fingers fumbling with the tiny buttons. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough over the past few weeks while this arrangement was being negotiated. She wouldn't cry anymore. Instead, she made herself a promise. Harrison Blackwell thought she was nothing. He thought this marriage was just a business transaction that would fade into polite distance. But Isabella had spent her whole life exceeding expectations, breaking through barriers, and proving doubters wrong. This would be no different. She didn't need him to love her. She didn't even need him to like her. But she would make damn sure he respected her. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to build something real from the ashes of this arranged disaster. As she finally freed herself from the wedding dress and let it pool on the floor, Isabella Monroe Blackwell looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her makeup was smudged, her carefully styled hair was coming loose, but her eyes were bright with determination. The game had begun. And she had every intention of winning. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Isabella's bedroom, but she had been awake long before dawn. Sleep had been impossible in the unfamiliar space, her mind racing with plans and strategies. At 6 in the morning, she had gone for a run through the estate grounds, startling the security team who weren't expecting the new Mrs. Blackwell to be an early riser. By 7:30, she was showered, dressed in a sharp navy suit that screamed professional competence, and reviewing financial reports on her laptop. At exactly 8:45, Isabella walked into the headquarters of Blackwell Industries. The building was a gleaming tower of steel and glass in the heart of the financial district, a monument to Harrison's success. She had been here before for meetings during the merger negotiations, but entering as Harrison's wife felt different. Every employee she passed stopped to stare, their curiosity barely concealed behind polite nods. The executive floor was on the 35th level, accessible only by a private elevator that required a special keycard. Isabella had found hers waiting on her breakfast tray that morning, along with a terse note from Harrison informing her that there would be a meeting at 9 to discuss the integration of Monroe Shipping into the Blackwell portfolio. No greeting, no acknowledgement of their wedding the day before. Just business. When the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by Harrison's executive assistant, a polished woman in her 40s named Emma who had been with him for over a decade. "Mrs. Blackwell," Emma said with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Blackwell is expecting you. The conference room is this way." Isabella followed her down a hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than most houses. The conference room was enormous, dominated by a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Harrison sat at the head of the table, flanked by 6 senior executives, all men in expensive suits who looked at Isabella with varying degrees of skepticism. Harrison barely glanced up from the documents in front of him. "You're early," he said, as if this were somehow a fault. "I prefer to be prepared," Isabella replied, taking a seat directly across from him rather than at his side. She wanted to face him as an equal, not stand beside him as an accessory. One of the executives, a silver-haired man Isabella recognized as Richard Sterling, the chief financial officer, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm sure you understand that these meetings typically involve only senior leadership with specific operational responsibilities." "Then it's fortunate that I have specific operational responsibilities," Isabella replied smoothly, opening her own laptop. "Monroe Shipping handled all of Blackwell's East Asian logistics for the past 3 years under our partnership agreement. I personally managed that relationship and increased efficiency by 23% while reducing costs by 15%. I know every route, every contact, and every potential problem in that market. So unless you'd like to spend the next 6 months trying to figure out what I already know, I suggest we treat this as the collaborative effort it needs to be." The room fell silent. Richard's face reddened slightly, but he said nothing. Harrison's eyes lifted from his papers, and for the first time that morning, he really looked at her. There was something calculating in his gaze, as if he were reassessing a situation he thought he had already figured out. "Very well," Harrison said finally. "Let's begin." The meeting lasted 3 hours, and it was brutal. Harrison presented a restructuring plan that would essentially dismantle Monroe Shipping's operational structure and absorb it completely into Blackwell Industries. Every suggestion Isabella made was met with dismissal or condescension from the male executives. But Isabella had not spent 5 years in a male-dominated industry without learning how to hold her ground. When Harrison proposed closing Monroe's West Coast distribution center and consolidating everything to Blackwell's facilities, Isabella interrupted. "That would be a mistake," she said firmly. Harrison's jaw tightened. "Based on what analysis?" Isabella pulled up a presentation she had prepared. "Based on the fact that Monroe's West Coast Center has exclusive relationships with 3 major Asian shipping lines that provide preferential rates and priority loading. Those relationships are personal, built over 20 years by my father and maintained by me. If we close that facility, we lose those relationships, and I guarantee you that Blackwell's competitors will snap them up within weeks. The cost savings you're projecting would be completely erased by the increased shipping rates we'd have to pay elsewhere." She clicked through her slides, showing detailed cost comparisons, relationship histories, and projected impacts. The numbers were irrefutable, and she had done her homework thoroughly. When she finished, the room was quiet again. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "And you believe you can maintain those relationships?" "I know I can," Isabella replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Because I already have. I've been on the phone with our key contacts in Hong Kong and Singapore since 6 this morning. They're nervous about the merger, worried that Blackwell will bring in their own people and forget the partnerships that made Monroe successful. I assured them that wouldn't happen. I hope I wasn't lying." Something flickered in Harrison's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just surprise that she had outmaneuvered him. We'll table the West Coast discussion for now and revisit it next quarter, he said finally. It was a small victory, but Isabella felt a surge of satisfaction. She had proven she wasn't just going to sit quietly and nod. The rest of the meeting proceeded with Isabella contributing detailed insights on operations, personnel, and market relationships. By the time it ended, the executives' attitudes had shifted from dismissive to grudgingly respectful. All except Harrison, whose expression remained carefully neutral. As everyone filed out, Harrison's voice stopped Isabella at the door. "A word, please." She turned back, waiting as he closed the door, leaving them alone in the conference room. He walked to the windows, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city below. The morning light cast his profile in sharp relief, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. "That was quite a performance," he said without turning around. "It wasn't a performance," Isabella replied. "It was competence. There's a difference." He turned to face her then, and she was struck again by how commanding his presence was. In the harsh light of day, she could see details she had missed during the wedding. The faint scar above his left eyebrow. The slight crookedness of his nose that suggested it had been broken at some point. The way his shoulders carried tension even when he appeared relaxed. "You made me look unprepared in front of my executive team," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You were unprepared," Isabella shot back. "You assumed you could steamroll over Monroe's operations without understanding what made them valuable in the first place. That's not my fault." Harrison took a step closer, and Isabella forced herself not to retreat. She could smell his cologne now, something expensive and understated. "Let's be clear about something, Isabella. I don't care what you did at Monroe Shipping. This is my company, built from nothing by my own hands. I won't have my authority undermined by someone who thinks a business degree and family connections make them qualified to challenge my decisions." The condescension in his tone ignited something fierce in Isabella's chest. She closed the distance between them until they were barely a foot apart, tilting her head back to look directly into his eyes. "And let's be clear about something else, Harrison. I didn't earn my position through family connections. I earned it through results. While you were building your empire by crushing competitors, I was building relationships and partnerships that actually created value. You married me thinking you were getting access to my father's business. What you actually got was the person who made that business worth acquiring in the first place. So you can either recognize that and work with me, or you can keep fighting me and watch your precious merger fall apart because you were too arrogant to accept help." They stared at each other, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. Isabella's heart was pounding, but she refused to look away or back down. She had meant every word. Harrison's eyes darkened, and something shifted in his expression. The anger was still there, but beneath it, she saw something else. Something that made her breath catch. Interest. Real, genuine interest. "You have fire," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I'll give you that." "I have more than fire," Isabella replied. "I have intelligence, skill, and determination. The question is whether you're smart enough to use those things instead of trying to extinguish them." A slow smile curved Harrison's lips, and it transformed his entire face. It wasn't the cold, polite smile he had worn at their wedding. This was something real, something dangerous. "All right, Isabella. You want to play in my world? Fine. But understand this. I don't go easy on anyone, wife or not. If you're going to work here, you'll be held to the same standards as everyone else. Actually, higher standards, because people will assume you're here because of our marriage, not your merit." "Good," Isabella said. "I prefer high standards. They give me something to exceed." Harrison laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "Neither are you," Isabella replied honestly. In the boardroom, arguing about business, he had come alive in a way she hadn't seen before. The cold, distant man from the wedding had been replaced by someone passionate and engaged, someone who cared deeply about what he had built. The moment stretched between them, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with business. Then Harrison's phone buzzed, breaking the spell. He glanced at it and frowned. "I have another meeting. Emma will set you up with an office and access to the systems you'll need. We'll have weekly strategy sessions to discuss the integration." He headed for the door, then paused. "And Isabella? What you said at the wedding? About me being nothing to you?" She tensed, waiting for his anger. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Make sure you remember that," he said softly. "Because mixing business with whatever this is between us would be a mistake neither of us can afford." Then he was gone, leaving Isabella alone in the conference room with her heart racing and her mind spinning. She had won the first battle, secured her place in the company. But Harrison's parting words echoed in her head, and she realized that the war between them had taken on a new, more complicated dimension. The next 2 weeks fell into a demanding rhythm. Isabella threw herself into work with fierce determination, arriving at the office before most of the executives and staying late into the evening. She dove deep into every aspect of the merger, identifying problems before they became crises and proposing solutions that even Harrison's skeptical team had to admit were brilliant. But it was during the weekly strategy sessions with Harrison that things became truly interesting. They would sit across from each other in his private office, the city sprawling below them, and argue about everything from shipping routes to personnel decisions. Their debates were intense, sometimes heated, but always productive. Isabella learned that Harrison respected well-reasoned arguments backed by solid data, and she made sure to provide both. What surprised her was how much she enjoyed these sessions. Harrison was brilliant, there was no denying that. His mind worked with a speed and precision that challenged her to keep up. He saw patterns and opportunities that others missed. And when they worked together, combining her relationship-building skills with his strategic vision, the results were remarkable. But there was something else happening too, something neither of them acknowledged but both clearly felt. The tension between them had evolved from purely adversarial to something more complex. Isabella found herself noticing things about him that had nothing to do with business. The way he absently ran his hand through his hair when he was frustrated. The rare, genuine smile that appeared when she made a particularly clever point. The intensity in his gray eyes when he looked at her, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. And she suspected he noticed things about her too. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable but focused in a way that made her skin tingle. One evening, 3 weeks after their wedding, they were working late on a particularly complicated contract negotiation. Everyone else had gone home, leaving them alone in Harrison's office with takeout containers and stacks of documents spread across his desk. "This clause here is going to be a problem," Isabella said, leaning over the desk to point at a specific paragraph. "The Japanese partners will never agree to those terms. In their culture, this kind of stipulation implies a lack of trust." Harrison moved to stand beside her, looking at the document. They were close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "What would you suggest instead?" Isabella picked up a pen and began marking up the document, explaining her reasoning as she went. Harrison listened intently, occasionally asking questions or offering his own insights. They were so focused on the work that Isabella didn't realize how close they had gotten until she turned to make a point and found her face inches from his. They both froze. Harrison's eyes dropped to her lips for just a fraction of a second before returning to meet her gaze. The air between them seemed to crackle with electricity. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice rough in a way she had never heard before. She should step back. She should say something professional and businesslike to break the moment. But she couldn't seem to move, caught in the intensity of his gaze. Harrison lifted his hand slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. His fingers lingered on her cheek, and Isabella's breath hitched. "This is a bad idea," Harrison murmured, but he didn't move away. Terrible, Isabella agreed, but she didn't move either. For a long moment, they simply stood there, teetering on the edge of something that would change everything. Then Harrison's phone rang, shattering the moment. He stepped back abruptly, running his hand through his hair in that gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. "I should get that," he said, his voice back to its usual controlled tone. "It's late. You should go home." Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice. She gathered her things quickly, hyper-aware of Harrison's presence as he answered his phone and began discussing business in clipped, professional tones. As she left his office and headed for the elevator, her mind was reeling. Something had almost happened between them, something that went far beyond their business arrangement. And the most terrifying part was how much she had wanted it to happen. The question was, what was she going to do about it? The following morning, Isabella woke with a knot of tension in her stomach that had nothing to do with business. She had barely slept, replaying that moment in Harrison's office over and over in her mind. The way he had looked at her, touched her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything she thought she knew about him. The way her entire body had responded to his proximity, her heart racing and her skin tingling with anticipation. This was dangerous territory. She had entered this marriage with clear boundaries, determined to keep her heart protected while she proved her professional worth. But somewhere along the way, those boundaries had started to blur. She found herself thinking about Harrison at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, whether he was thinking about her too. And last night had confirmed what she had been trying to deny for weeks. The attraction between them was real, powerful, and mutual. By the time Isabella arrived at the office, she had convinced herself that the professional thing to do was pretend nothing had happened. They were adults. They could maintain their working relationship without acknowledging the personal tension simmering beneath the surface. It was the only logical approach. That plan lasted exactly 3 hours. At 11, Emma appeared at Isabella's office door looking unusually flustered. "Mrs. Blackwell, there's a situation developing that Mr. Blackwell needs you to be aware of immediately. Conference room 3, please." Isabella grabbed her tablet and followed Emma, her professional instincts overriding her personal confusion. When she entered the conference room, she found Harrison standing at the windows, his posture radiating tension. 3 of his senior executives sat at the table looking grim, and on the large screen dominating one wall was a live news feed. "What's happening?" Isabella asked, moving to stand beside Harrison. "Our biggest shipping contract just fell through," Harrison said without looking at her, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Chen Industries in Singapore. They're pulling out of the 5-year agreement we signed 2 months ago, citing concerns about the merger affecting service quality." Isabella's stomach dropped. Chen Industries represented nearly 30% of their Asian-Pacific business. Losing them would be catastrophic, potentially triggering a domino effect with other nervous clients. Did they give specific reasons? "Corporate double talk about restructuring concerns and market volatility," Richard Sterling said from the table, his face pale. "But reading between the lines, they don't trust that we can maintain the level of personalized service they had with Monroe Shipping. Because they think we're going to dismantle everything and force them into a one-size-fits-all Blackwell system," Isabella said, understanding immediately. "They worked with my father for 15 years. They value relationships over efficiency metrics." Harrison finally turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "Can you fix this?" It wasn't a request. It was a challenge, a test, and possibly their last chance to save the merger from imploding. Isabella held his gaze, seeing not just the business crisis in his eyes but something deeper. Trust. He was trusting her with something that mattered enormously to him. "I can try," she said. "But I'll need complete authority to negotiate our terms. No interference, no second guessing." "You'll have it," Harrison said immediately, then turned to his executives. "Isabella has full authority to handle this situation. Whatever she needs, she gets. Richard, I want our legal team on standby. Everyone else, clear your schedules. If Chen walks, we're going to need crisis management across all our Asian contracts. For the next 6 hours, Isabella worked with an intensity she had never experienced before. She called in every favor, leveraged every relationship, and used every negotiation tactic she had learned over the years. The problem was that David Chen, the company's CEO, wasn't answering her calls. He was sending his assistant with polite deflections, which meant he had already made his decision and was just being diplomatic about the exit. By 5 in the evening, Isabella was exhausted and frustrated. She sat in her office, staring at her phone, trying to figure out her next move. A knock at her door made her look up. Harrison stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Peace offering," he said, entering without waiting for permission and setting 1 cup on her desk. "You look like you could use it." "I've hit a wall," Isabella admitted, too tired to maintain her usual professional facade. "Chen won't take my calls. He's already decided to walk, and I can't negotiate if I can't even get him on the phone." Harrison sat in the chair across from her desk, studying her with that intense focus that always made her feel simultaneously exposed and seen. "What if we went to Singapore? Tonight. Show up at his office tomorrow morning before he can dodge us." Isabella blinked. "That's a 20-hour journey. We'd arrive exhausted, jet-lagged, and at a disadvantage. Or we'd arrive demonstrating that we take his business seriously enough to fly halfway around the world on 12 hours' notice," Harrison countered. "Chen is old school. He values face-to-face relationships. You said it yourself, that's what Monroe Shipping gave him that my company couldn't. So let's give him that. You and me, together, showing him that the merger doesn't mean the end of personalized service." The idea was bold, possibly reckless, but Isabella could see the logic in it. More than that, she could see that Harrison was right. If they were going to save this contract, they needed to do something dramatic. "When do we leave?" "My plane is ready whenever we are," Harrison said, standing. "Go home, pack a bag for 3 days. I'll pick you up at 8. 2 hours later, Isabella found herself sitting in the luxurious cabin of Harrison's private jet as it climbed into the night sky. The interior was all cream leather and polished wood, with a bedroom in the back, a full office setup, and seating that converted into beds. She had changed into comfortable clothes for the long flight, dark jeans and a soft cashmere sweater, and pulled her hair into a simple ponytail. Harrison emerged from the bedroom area where he had been changing, now wearing jeans and a black t-shirt that emphasized his athletic build in a way his business suits never did. Isabella tried not to stare, focusing instead on her laptop and the presentation she was refining for their meeting with Chen. "You should try to sleep," Harrison said, settling into the seat across from her with his own laptop. "We'll need to be sharp tomorrow." "I will in a bit," Isabella replied. "I just want to get this presentation perfect first." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the hum of the jet engines and the occasional click of keyboards. It felt different from working together in the office. More intimate somehow, cocooned together in this small space miles above the earth with nowhere to go and no one to perform for. "Can I ask you something?" Harrison said suddenly, looking up from his screen. Isabella saved her document and gave him her full attention. "Of course. Why did you really agree to marry me?" He held up a hand before she could answer. "I know the official reason. Your father's company, the merger, all of that. But you could have fought it. You're smart enough and strong enough to have found another way. So why didn't you?" The question caught Isabella off guard. She had expected many things from this trip, but not this kind of personal honesty. She considered deflecting, giving him the easy answer about family duty. But something about the moment, the privacy and the vulnerability in his question, made her want to tell him the truth. "Because I was tired of fighting," she said quietly. "My whole life, I've had to fight twice as hard as any man to be taken seriously in business. Fight to prove I wasn't just coasting on my family name. Fight to show that I had real skills and real value. When my father came to me with this arrangement, I saw it as one more battle I didn't have the energy to win. It felt easier to just accept it and make the best of the situation. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes reflecting something that looked like understanding. "I know what that's like," he said finally. "The constant fighting, I mean. I built Blackwell Industries from nothing. Started with one truck and a dream when I was 22. Every step of the way, people told me I would fail. That I was too young, too ambitious, too ruthless. I had to fight for every contract, every partnership, every dollar. And somewhere along the way, I forgot how to do anything else but fight." It was the most personal thing he had ever shared with her, and Isabella felt something shift between them. "Is that why you agreed to the marriage?" she asked. "Because it was another battle you needed to win?" "Partly," Harrison admitted. "But also because I was tired too. Tired of being alone. Tired of relationships that were really just networking opportunities in disguise. When your father proposed the merger and the marriage, I told myself it was purely strategic. A way to eliminate a competitor and gain access to markets I couldn't crack on my own. But I think part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, it could be something more than another business transaction." Isabella's heart was beating faster now. "And then I declared at our wedding that you were nothing to me," she said softly, understanding now why those words had landed so hard. "Yeah," Harrison said with a rueful smile. "That was not the hopeful start I had imagined. Though I suppose I deserved it after the way I treated you. I was trying to protect myself, to keep this purely professional so I wouldn't get hurt. But that's not working out so well." "No," Isabella agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's really not." Their eyes met across the cabin, and the electricity that had been building between them for weeks seemed to intensify. Harrison stood slowly and moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body. "Isabella," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something. That moment in my office last night, when I almost kissed you, that wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. I've been wanting to do that for weeks now. Every time you challenge me in a meeting, every time you prove me wrong with that brilliant mind of yours, every time you stand up for yourself and refuse to be intimidated, I want you more. And it's driving me crazy because this wasn't supposed to happen. We weren't supposed to happen." Isabella's breath caught. Every rational part of her brain was screaming that this was dangerous, that letting him in would make her vulnerable in ways she had sworn to avoid. But her heart was louder than her head, and the truth was undeniable. "I feel it too," she admitted. "I've been trying to fight it, to keep things professional, but Harrison, when I'm with you, when we're working together and arguing and pushing each other, I feel more alive than I have in years. You challenge me in ways no one else does. You see me, really see me, not just as someone's daughter or someone's wife, but as myself. And that's terrifying and exhilarating, and I don't know what to do with it." Harrison reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. The simple touch sent electricity racing through her entire body. "What if we stopped fighting it?" he suggested quietly. "What if we took this marriage that we both entered reluctantly and tried to make it into something real? I can't promise it will be easy. I'm not good at relationships or expressing emotions. I've spent so long building walls that I'm not sure I remember how to let them down. But Isabella, I want to try. With you, I want to try." Tears stung Isabella's eyes, but they were good tears, tears of relief and hope. "I want that too," she whispered. "I'm scared. I'm terrified actually. But I want to try." Harrison cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that had escaped. "I'm scared too," he confessed. "But I think the scariest thing would be letting you go without ever knowing what we could be together." This time, when he leaned in to kiss her, there was no interruption, no pulling back at the last second. His lips met hers softly at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the waters of this new territory. But then Isabella's hands came up to grip his shoulders, and the kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and passionate and full of all the longing they had been suppressing for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "Well," he said with a breathless laugh, "that was worth waiting for." Isabella laughed too, feeling lighter than she had in months. "We should probably still try to sleep before the meeting tomorrow," she said practically, even as her body was humming with energy. "Probably," Harrison agreed, but he didn't move away. Instead, he pulled her closer, tucking her against his side. "But maybe we could just sit like this for a while first?" "I'd like that," Isabella said, resting her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Harrison told her about his childhood, growing up poor with a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. How he had promised her when he was 12 that someday he would give her everything she deserved, and how that promise had driven him to build his empire. Isabella shared her own stories, about the pressure of being the only child of a business dynasty, about her mother's struggles with depression, about her dreams of making her own mark on the world independent of her family name. With each story shared, each vulnerability revealed, the walls between them crumbled a little more. By the time exhaustion finally overtook them and they made their way to the bedroom to sleep, they weren't the same 2 people who had boarded the plane. They were something new, something hopeful, something that felt like the beginning of a real partnership. The meeting with David Chen the next morning was intense but ultimately successful. The combination of Isabella's relationship-building skills and Harrison's strategic vision, now working in true harmony rather than opposition, convinced Chen that the merger would strengthen rather than weaken their partnership. By the time they left Singapore 3 days later, they had not only saved the Chen contract but had secured 2 additional major clients who had been wavering. On the flight home, Isabella sat beside Harrison, their hands intertwined, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "So what happens now?" she asked. "When we get home, do we tell people? Do we keep pretending this is just business?" Harrison turned to look at her, and the warmth in his eyes made her heart skip. "I'm done pretending," he said firmly. "I want the world to know that my wife is not just a brilliant business partner but the woman I'm falling in love with. If you're okay with that." Falling in love. The words hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and wonderful. Isabella knew she should be cautious, should protect her heart, should remember that this had all started as a business arrangement. But when she looked at Harrison, at the hope and vulnerability and genuine emotion in his face, she knew that ship had already sailed. "I'm more than okay with that," she said, leaning in to kiss him. "Because I'm falling in love with you too, Harrison Blackwell. And I have to say, you're turning out to be so much more than nothing to me." Harrison laughed and pulled her closer. "Good," he said against her lips. "Because you conquered my heart, Isabella. Completely and absolutely. And I have no intention of ever letting you go." 3 months later, they stood together at a company event, surrounded by employees and partners and competitors, all watching the power couple that had transformed 2 rival companies into an unstoppable force. But Isabella barely noticed the crowd. She was too focused on the man beside her, the man who had started as her reluctant husband and had become her true partner in every sense of the word. "Happy?" Harrison murmured in her ear, his arm around her waist. Isabella looked up at him, at the face she had once thought was cold and unfeeling but now knew could light up with warmth and laughter and love. "Incredibly," she said honestly. "Though I have to admit, our wedding day feels like it happened to different people." "It did, in a way," Harrison said thoughtfully. "We're not the same people we were then. We're better. Stronger. Together." "You know," Isabella said with a mischievous smile, "I've been thinking. We should probably have another wedding. A real one this time, where we both actually want to be there and mean the words we're saying." Harrison's eyes lit up. "Are you proposing to me, Mrs. Blackwell?" "Maybe I am," Isabella said. What do you say, Mr. Blackwell? Want to marry me for real this time? I'd marry you 100 times, Harrison said, cupping her face and kissing her right there in front of everyone, no longer caring who saw or what they thought. Every single day for the rest of our lives if you'd let me. As applause and wolf whistles erupted around them, Isabella laughed against his lips, her heart full to bursting. She had entered this marriage thinking it was the end of her dreams, a sacrifice she was making for her family. But it had turned out to be the beginning of something she had never dared to dream of at all. A true partnership built on respect, passion, challenge, and most importantly, love. Harrison had vowed to conquer her heart, but the truth was they had conquered each other's, turning an arrangement born of business necessity into a love story neither of them had seen coming. And as they stood together, stronger as a team than they had ever been apart, Isabella knew that this was just the beginning of their story. The best chapters were still to come.